All right, last night I went to visit an old friend of mine, and the main uh, venue of our relationship is to talk about and do things related to guns. I go shooting with him a lot in the past. I haven't recently, but over the years. And we were chatting for a while, and another member of his family, his father, came, and he's also someone who I've known for a very long time. And he mentioned what is essentially an internet rumor that he had heard. And I qualify this and that I'm not endorsing this. I'm not saying that I know that this is true or even that I think it's particularly likely, but it seemed plausible enough and possible enough that it certainly gave me pause, more so than pretty much anything I've heard in quite a while. And that was his belief, or what he had read to be the belief of others, that Barack Obama intends to essentially outlaw all semi automatic guns. What I mean by that is he is going to, the allegation here, which is, I have to say, based on speculation, that he will, that Congress has a majority of Republicans in the House and not a majority in the Senate, but enough swing Democrats who have their balls in the vice of the NRA that is practically impossible that anything can get passed through Congress. Even when we have mass shootings, like we've had several this year, not any more than normal. We have about the same number every year, but they get higher and higher profile, it seems. Um, Nothing's going to get passed through the House or the Senate. But the allegation is that he will do something through executive power, something that has grown under conservative and liberal presidencies. And the idea would be he would issue an executive order to the ATF to reclassify um, certain types of guns, allegedly all semi-automatic ones, so all Glocks and Berettas, all semi-automatic handguns, all semi-automatic rifles, and say, well, they're still legal, but now they're classified as Class 3 firearms, which is what fully automatic machine guns are currently classed at, and that you can still own them, but you have to get fingerprinted. You have to have more background checks. You have to have more, uh, you know, uh, you have to get prior authorization to buy or sell them, and there's a $200 tax you have to pay on each and every one of them every year. So if you had 5 semi-automatic weapons, that would be $1,000 a year in taxes plus other fees. Uh, Fully automatic weapons, and this is something that a lot of people don't understand. Most people think that they're actually illegal. They're not illegal. They're just Class 3 firearms. Not, some of them are, but and Class 3 firearms essentially makes them illegal. So the idea here is that he would effectively ban tens, dozens of millions of guns, affecting tens or dozens of millions of gun owners, because that's at least the numbers we're talking about who own these types of weapons. I'm sure lots of gun owners who don't own any semi-automatic weapons. There are very effective weapons that are not semi-automatic: revolvers, pump-action shotguns, bolt-action rifles, and the like. But this is a huge number of people, and basically they'll go through the forms that you fill out when you buy such weapons at gun stores, which isn't a requirement everywhere, and then say, okay, turn them in or get the registration, the very expensive registration, and it's basically a tax that would reduce the legal ownership. Now, I'm not saying this is going to happen. I don't know that it is. I don't have any reason to think that it's actually that dramatic. Of all the things that Obama might try, there's any number of gradients of this that are possible. The story that I was told was, well, he's waiting until he gets his next swearing in, until he, January, whatever. That timing to me seems rather arbitrary. He's the president now. He's the president-elect now. I don't see any reason, and if anyone can think of one, please say so in the comments, why he should need to wait till then. The congressional situation isn't going to change very much. If anything, it would seem more favorable to me now, because as soon as a new batch of Congress comes in, they're going to be thinking about their next election, and this might be the single most explosive issue that they can have a stance on. And if he were to do anything in the next session, it would be kind of on them to do something about it. So I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm worried that it might. And this is my warning to gun owners. You and I and everyone out there needs to be preparing for the possibility that this or something along these lines, perhaps not necessarily of the scope or what I'm talking about. Who knows? It could be worse. He could potentially say all guns are Class 3 weapons now. That would be really quite unprecedented. Even just semi-automatics would be unbelievably unprecedented. There'd be nothing anywhere close to that in the history of the United States in terms of gun control. I think it would be safe to say that all previous gun control combined would not be as great an impediment to our liberties. Now, if the one, I like the gun rights movement. I love it to death. I'm glad, for all the qualms I have about the NRA, that they have enormous political influence in the legislatures, both at the national and at the state level. I like that they have basically legislators in their pockets, that they have their balls in a vice, at least many of them. Not everywhere in the world, or everywhere in the country, but in many places. I'm glad about that. But one Achilles heel that I've always seen with the gun rights movement, and it's not applicable to everyone in the gun rights movement all the time, is that there is a lack of identification of who their antagonist is, likely to, or actually is. Gun rights people tend to view their enemies as their opposites in the social culture war. So, liberals, Dianne Feinstein's, the meme hippie girl that you always see on Facebook who has dreadlocks, like they're their enemy. And they are. They're against gun rights. They're against lots of things. They're terrible people. But the person who's going to come and confiscate your guns or demand that you register them is not those people. It's going to be a clean-cut, conservative police officer with a badge who has served his country in the military, more than likely, who goes to church and goes to football games and goes hunting. It's going to be the police and military that are going to do it, if it ever comes to that. And I hope that it doesn't, and I'm not saying that it will. But if it ever were to, it's going to be them. It's not going to be the hippie college students. That's never going to happen. It's going to be those institutions that, unfortunately, Americans tend to have a pretty high esteem of, and especially the typical conservative pro-gun owner have a fairly laudatory view both of the military and of law enforcement. And I'm not one to say that you should automatically and always have an antagonistic view against them. I have friends who are in law enforcement or police officers. I have more than a few who are in the military, and I engage with them in every chance I get. I talk to them. I try and, feel out how they feel about these issues, and I ask them, what would you do if you were asked to do X, Y, or Z? Gun confiscation, arrests, property, that sort of things. And to challenge them to think about what they would do in those situations and to make the right decision. But you should never assume that they're going to be your friend or that they're not going to follow orders. The bureaucracy is very large, and I'm sure there are people in both police and military who would have serious qualms about, say, gun confiscation. Some of them will probably try and ignore it or do a really crappy job. I could see local police, for instance, going door to door, asking people if they have guns, and if they say no, just going, okay, fine, and leaving. That will probably happen. And I can see some who would actively resist. But that's going to be probably a minority, and probably a pretty small minority. And it will be isolated and rejected from the bureaucracy. Those good cops and good soldiers will be, if not liquidated, if things are really bad, at the very least fired, and replaced by more pliant civil servants, so to speak, who now have the example of knowing if they go against the grain, they'll lose their pension, their paycheck, their living, everything, and are thus far less likely to oppose these dictates. And so, if you're a gun owner and you're out there and you hate Obama and you're against gun control, and but you don't have an at least a suspicious view of the institutions that he controls, then you are heading for trouble. And I'm not saying anything's going to happen in January, or the thing I've outlined here is going to happen at all or anytime soon. Then again, it could. And if it doesn't happen soon, it could happen some point in the future. And so you need to be mentally prepared to understand that your liberties, they're going to be taken by the government. They're not going to be taken by the liberal media, although they'll certainly aid and abet in doing that. It's not going to be the professors. They're not going to come door to door to take your gun, ever. They will lend their fallacious authority to give a veneer of legitimacy to whatever acts the government does. So I'm sure there'll be professors who will write op-eds about how gun confiscation or classifying all semi-automatics as class 3 guns is good. There are probably some criminologists who would say this. I'm sure there are lots of chiefs of police who have their eyes set on political office who are going to be more than happy to come out and say this is the right thing to do, even if there are lots of beat cops who don't agree with that. And I know there are a lot of beat cops that don't agree with that. I've been in small towns and in big cities, and the beat cops tend to think civilian gun ownership is a good idea, and they encourage it. They're even willing to sell firearms to civilians, including semi-automatic handguns and rifles. Not every beat cop ever, but some of them. But their bosses tend to have political ambitions, and in urban centers, that tends to be liberal democratic ones, and they are willing to say anything to those ends. And so I think people need to start thinking, what are they going to do? And I'm not saying that the implication there is violent resistance. That doesn't necessarily imply that. And we all hope to God that that's not what happens. And I think that's the one thing we really have going for us. If Obama was to do something like this, it's not clear what would happen. I don't know what would happen. You don't know what's going to happen. Barack Obama does not know what would happen. We might think, well, there might be some bitching and some moaning, but maybe I think most people would just put up with it. They'd either destroy their guns, they'd sell them, or they'd turn them in. That's going to be most people. Some people are not going to do that, and that means that they're either going to hide them, they're going to lie, they're going to sell them, or they're going to claim that they sold them, which, by the way, just to be clear here, is something that they have the ability to do right now, and this could make logistically finding door-to-door almost impossible. And there are some people who will not give them up except from their cold dead hands. How many people? I don't know. But even if we start doing like 1/10 of 1%, that's hundreds of thousands of people. And what would that look like? I don't know. I don't want to find out. I hope I never do. But I don't want to find out, and I have this feeling that any politician who isn't a complete moron would feel the same way. And I don't think Barack Obama is a complete moron. Evil, yes. Complete moron, no. That doesn't mean he wouldn't hedge his bets and try. I'm just saying I think that's what we have going for us. Now, the other thing I think we have going for us is our numbers. Take it from somebody who's in an extreme minority in his political philosophy. I am always running up against the fact that the vast majority of people don't believe anything close to what I believe in. Gun rights is something I'm very happy to say is much more mainstream view than anything else that I think. probably, more or less, other than maybe free speech and freedom of religion. There are hundreds of millions of gun owners in this country. All right, the registration, to the extent that it exists now, is at best very spotty and leaves enormous room for leeway. The only way that they are ever going to get all the guns in is if there is massive amounts of cooperation. And if that doesn't happen, there is no effective way for them to do it. There are not enough agents to go door to door everywhere and search every house and do everything. The court is not big enough. If this got dragged out in the courts, all kinds of legal decisions are going to be had. We're going to have some judges who are going to say yes, some who are going to say no. If it gets hairy enough, there are going to be states that are going to start saying this is not going to happen. Some states that are. I would say, because right now you get a NICS background check when you buy a gun at a dealership, but in most states you don't need to do that if you resell, and you don't have to have a record of who you sold it to, as long as you believe that the person's not a felon, which most gun owners are not. Then you don't have to have a record. And so, I don't know, officer, I sold that gun several years ago, is plausible. In fact, it happens millions and millions of times every year. So this is something where, I'm not saying to fight. I'm saying don't make it easy. Don't make it easy. And then there is a question here about, just giving in because it's easier. And we all feel that way because we all have lives to live, And that whole Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death, it sounds very extreme. But anyone who looks at history seriously has to come to the conclusion that if you give up your liberty on the promise that you're going to keep your life is forfeit anyway. If you don't have freedom, a certain amount of it anyway, then you are at the whim of those who you surrender your liberty to. And that's not security. That's not safety. They may allow you to live, they may not. They may make you a slave. They may do anything. Once you've surrendered the right to self-defense to them, then all your prerogatives are gone. I remember, see right here, this guy, The Gulag Archipelago. This is part 1 by Solzhenitsyn. Moving book. I have not read the other parts because it was so hard to just read that part. I'm kind of worried to keep going. Eventually I will. But he talks about how they did not have guns in the Soviet Union. Gun culture was not big in Russia. The Tsars pretty much restricted it heavily. Of course, there were agriculturists and trappers and stuff who had access to them. It wasn't a totally gun-free society, but it was not an armed society either. And through the several layers of the revolution, they were basically completely detoothed. And he talks about how that doesn't matter. When they came for them, it would have been better to resist it with rakes, picks, sticks, stones, than to go to the gulag. And the bright side is, if everyone had done that, or even a large minority of the people had done that, there's no way it could have ever worked. The only way you get 6 million people killed, to use a more cliched example, is if they just walk onto the trains. Don't do that. I'm not saying join the Wolverines necessarily. I mean, if you feel the need, and okay, but I'm saying don't just make it easy for them. And you have to be mentally prepared for that. And to an extent you can't. I mean, there's no way to practice for something that you've never experienced. And I know that just for myself. I say these things, but what would I really do? It's hard to say. I know what I think I should. But you need to be mentally prepared to think that the institutions that you laud the most in society, the police, the military, even the government, they're the ones who are your potential antagonists here. And again, I hope it doesn't happen. And I'm not just crossing my fingers. I think, you hear stuff on the internet all the time, and I don't know, for all the things that we've heard Obama's going to do about gun control, he hasn't really done anything. His rhetoric has been very, very muted. If anything like this happened, it would be so outrageous that I cannot begin to predict what would happen. And I think that's what we have going for us. But in case that optimism or pragmatism turns out to be unjustified, and the pessimism of the guy I was talking to earlier turns out to be justified. You need to be prepared for that, because even if it doesn't happen now, it may happen in the future. And the idea that you can just hide behind the NRA, hide behind the good old boys in your local town who you figure are never going to do anything, which may be true, but we don't know that. So please, 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 mentally prepare yourself and physically prepare yourself also. Maybe in time to invest in waterproof steel containers and saran wrap, and I'll leave you to the logistics, but uh, this isn't like an alert or anything. I'm just saying that you need to be mentally in that, because if you get, what tends to happen is people get caught with their pants down. People think everything's going to be fine. Here are my plans, and then something like this happens potentially, and it's like, oh, now what? So uh, it's a game of musical chairs, and don't be the guy left standing up, I guess. So that's it. Oh, and check out the shirt too. They have a pertinent opinion on this matter also. Or they did anyway.